I'm delighted to be here today at the Westward Look in Tucson, talking with Professor James C. Cox, the Noah Langdale Jr. Chair in Economics and the Director of the Experimental Economics Center at Georgia State University. Before moving to Georgia State, Professor Cox was the Director of the Economic Science Laboratory from 2001 to 2006. So thank you for sitting with me.
It's a pleasure to be here, to participate in this project, and of course to return to the Westward Look, where it all began.
We're delighted to have you back. Let me start with how you got into experimental economics. So early in your career, you were doing primarily theoretical and policy-oriented research that was not experimental. What led you to begin doing experimental research in addition to your earlier work?
Yeah, that's quite true. Earlier in my career, I was doing theory, some of it pretty abstract and some mathematical economics, but also policy-oriented research. And the way that led me to experimental is actually a kind of convoluted path, but I think people may find it interesting. So the policy-oriented research, I did a long series of papers with Arthur Wright, and we also were doing a bunch of US Senate and House testifying, because we were doing that work at about the right time after the original oil embargo. And so they were looking for people who had had some credentials in the mid-70s in that area. And no doubt the leading academic paper that we had was a paper published in the AER, and it was looking at the implications of the special tax treatment of the oil industry. And looking at that in terms of, was it a good use of taxpayers' money to give them this subsidy through the revenue side of the budget? And what were its implications for energy independence, which became the big issue then. And at some point, we wanted to extend the model that was in the AER paper. And we went back and took a close study at the data we were using, which is data that came from the American Petroleum Institute, or API. And it was the same data that was then, and I think still, used by the US government. And when we attempted to extend the study that was in the AER paper, the model, we found that a key division between two types of costs, what are called tangible drilling costs and intangible drilling costs. When we study it, they're critical because one type is expensed and the other depreciated over 20 years. This is an incredible difference. And it was the key to what we were looking at in our model. When we looked at that data very carefully and looked at the division of the costs, we did an OLS fit to it, and we got a perfect fit.
Very interesting.
In other words, we discovered the rule to which they had constructed this division that was never in the data they collected. So that was other people didn't know about it, but we did, and this is terrible because this was one of the things that was at the heart of this AER paper. So that was something that was kind of a rude thing to me. And it caused me to think about things that occurred during my graduate studies. So I had the great privilege as a graduate student to take a course in economic development from Simon Kuznets. This is about the 3 or 4 years before he got the third awarded Nobel Prize in economics for his historical approach to studying economic development. And of course, he is one of the founders of national income accounting. Well, that class, it was back in, of course, the chalk and talk days, and towards in the last third of the semester, we students would give our papers to the class. And it's typical, you'd go to the blackboard, you write your model on the blackboard, and then start talking about the data that you were going to use to apply it. And the early students really had kind of some bad experience because they'd present the model and then they'd talk about the data, and with only some indirection, Kuznets would ask them a question that essentially amounted to, what makes you think there's any relationship between these variables in your theoretical model and the data that you are going to use? And like deer in the headlights graduate student would give an answer that essentially said, well, they have the same name. And then Kuznets would pounce. And he would say, if you do not know how those data were collected, you do not know what you're doing. Okay. Well, in experimental economics, we know how the data are collected. We're professionally responsible to it. Another thing that happened in that same class, there were in this class, there were a couple of people who were on mid-career people on leave from government jobs in Pakistan. And one day, in the class, one of the American students was presenting a paper, and it turned out they were going to use some variables to apply the model to variables from the national income and products accounts of Pakistan. And I noticed that my Pakistani classmates, we were all sitting about, I and they were sitting in about the middle of the room, that they were like desperately trying to not burst out laughing. And I saw they struggle. And so afterwards, after the class was over, I went up to them outside the class and I said, I see, you seem to have some big problem with this. What was the problem? And they say, well, we are on leave from the office that makes up those numbers. And I was naive enough at the time to be
hilarious.
Like shocked. And I said, well, how can you do that? And they said, well, in order for Pakistan to qualify for various UN aid programs, we have to publish national income and products accounts data, and we have no way of collecting that data. So in order to qualify for the aid, we invent the numbers and publish them. Okay. So these are two things that set me up to be suspicious of published data. In particular, since it was in the class of Simon Kuznets, who invented a lot of it.
Yes.
And so after having my bad experience in my own work with the AER paper, I really started thinking about whether I really wanted to use published data anymore. And at about that time, my spousal dual career, well, I guess dual careers is always a problem, allowed me to leave the UMass Amherst and to seek jobs elsewhere. One of the places I interviewed was the U of A, University of Arizona, and two of my former UMass Amherst colleagues had already moved here, Ron Mahaka and Brennan Smith. And when I visited for a job talk, I was presenting a paper on bidding theory, auction theory. It came out of the energy policy research because I was applying it first to the oil lease auctions. And when I presented that, it was at the same time when Vernon had gone back to doing experiments on auctions. And he sort of mentioned, he said, well, if you join our department, maybe we might join this because you're doing the theory. And so I did join, and this is well known. I think the first paper was co-authored with Vernon and with Bruce Roberson, and then there was a long series of papers with Vernon and with Jimmy Walker that came out.
That's been a very influential line of research.
That came out of that, and so those are so that's why I was ready to do experiments where where the data, how the data were collected, you did it, you're responsible for it, your reputation is on the line with it, and it made it very attractive to me. And the other thing was, it was when I started to do this because initially I was doing the theory. I had no idea about how to design and run an experiment, but who better to learn it from than the pioneer? But what intrigued me was the way the theory was being used to design the experiment. And if you remember that CRS paper, it's really heavily uses theory in the design.
Yes, it does.
And then how you use the data from the experiment to test the theory to see whether it is empirically a good theory. And so that's the sort of background and how I got into doing experimental economics.
So when you first began doing experimental research, did you have an inkling that you were part of something that was going to be very big, that you were part of an emerging field that would eventually become as large and influential as it is now?
Initially, I had no such inkling, no such idea. I was simply wanting to do research that I found very interesting and continue to do theoretical research, but participate in the design of the experiments and to do high quality work. I had no idea of anything larger. Over time, seeing the full extent of what we were getting into, and then starting to interact with the Caltech experimentalists, and there was a lot of interaction, as you know, and over time I started to get a really good idea of the importance of what was happening. But initially I had no idea. But after we'd been doing it a few years and all this interaction, I started to get a very good idea.
It was clear that you were part of something.
Part of something that could turn out to be really big. Yeah.
So how would you say that ESL contributed to the emergence of experimental economics as a discipline? What's the contribution generally of ESL?
Well, the first part of the contribution, of course, was that Vernon Smith was here at ESL and being the pioneer. But well beyond that, the way the process developed is that there were a whole series of experiments being done by researchers at ESL in several different areas that I don't think it's saying too much to say we're setting an example to the profession about how to apply experimental methods in economics, and that there was a lot of interaction with researchers at Caltech, cross-fertilization, and they were setting the example, and we were interacting with each other. So I think the critical leadership, and in fact I sometimes use the term that in the early days it was like an Arizona Caltech axis that was driving this process, and it was leading by providing examples. There was another way in which ESL was essential, and that is in the creation of the Economic Science Association, because there were 4 Tucson experimental economics workshops. I didn't attend the first one. It's before I joined the U of A department. I attended the second one, and as I recall, there were 12 people there, held in a room at the Arizona Inn down near campus. But by the 4th workshop, which was here at the Westward Look, we had drawn up the bylaws to create the Economic Science Association, and there was a committee of us at ESL, U of A Economics Department that drew that up, but there was interaction with Charlie Plott and other people at Caltech. And so it was instrumental because it came out of ESL. The ideas for creating Economic Science Association, the energy, the drive to do it, and I know very much about that because I was given the great honor of chairing the meeting where we adopted the bylaws and created it. It was here at the Westward Look, one of the rooms downstairs, and I remember it vividly.
In which year would that have been?
1986.
So speaking of ESA, you were president of the Economic Science Association during the period 1995 to 1997, and that was a period of changes in the Economic Science Association. Can you tell us about the key changes that were made during your presidency of ESA?
Yes, I can. There were, I would say, 4 key changes, but your dates are a little bit off.
I'm sorry.
I was president from 1997 to 1999, and the first key changes again occurred at a meeting at the Westward Look in 1996, Tom Palfrey was president, and I was president-elect.
I see.
We were working closely together on this, although Tom was clearly providing the leadership. And there were 2 very key changes. One of them was internationalizing ESA to create what at the time was called the position of European Secretary. It's now European Vice President. And we amended the bylaws to create the European Secretary position and provide for both what became known then as international meetings and regional meetings to be held in Europe as well as in the US. And that was absolutely key development. At the same meeting, we created the journal, Experimental Economics. And both of these things were very controversial, and there was a lot of resistance because a very high proportion of our members had always come to the meetings at the Westward Look and never wanted to go anywhere else to have these meetings. And there had been resistance for a long time to creating our own journal because in fact, there had been multiple proposals to create the journal from publishers, and we had both people at ESL and at Caltech had resisted this strongly. I mean, we resisted it up to the point of telling the publishers not only would we not, any of us, be on a board or agree to be editors, and furthermore, we would boycott the journals if you created them. And this was very, very strong. And the idea was, because we were still in the period of time where we were fighting for acceptance amongst the general readership journals of experimental economics papers. I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand now how much of a battle we had for acceptance. And the model we had in mind was a public choice society who created their own journal very early and then encountered the things. They'd send a public choice paper to a general readership journal, and they'd say, well, you have your own journal, don't bother us with it, send it there. And so before we were willing to support creating a journal, we figured we had to win the battle of getting acceptance of papers in general readership journals. And that was a difficult process at first. And so those 2 things were critical, and it was very, very close. So Tom was leading this, but I was doing a lot of political coalition building and giving speeches at that members meeting, and we succeeded, but narrowly, in those 2 key things.
That's fascinating.
The next 2 key things were when I was president, and this sort of completed the process. So when I was president, the first meetings in Europe were at Mannheim in 1998, and there it was it was absolutely critical that those meetings be successful, and they were highly successful. And I certainly don't want to take all the in large part because Martin Weber was in charge of the local program, and he did a fantastic job. But at those meetings, there was still a final problem to be solved, and that is that there was still a lot of resistance in some places in Europe to joining this American organization. And in particular, there was strong resistance amongst a lot of the older economists from Germany, led by no less than Reinhard Zelten. And so he was strongly opposed to this, because he wanted the Europeans to join the far older German organization. And so this was and if we had not been able,
period.
Pardon?
It was a tense
Yeah, and if we had not been able to bring the Germans into ESA, we would have failed at the internationalization. So we had this like power dinner where all the supporters and opponents to the internationalization are around this big table, and wasn't clear how this was going to come out. And the first person who spoke was Zelten, strongly opposed to it. And I was president, so I was chairing the meeting. So I started to jump in and reply. And fortunately, some of the German economists who were supporters were sitting right across the table from me, and they said, "Jim," they were telling me like this, "Don't do it, don't do it. Let us respond." And fortunately, as my natural inclination is to, and they responded, and then the conversation went around this long table, there was some things that were said that were pretty colorful that maybe I sort of won't put in a public interview, but I would be happy to talk about later. At the end of this, it was clear that the balance of both the Americans and the Europeans was that this would go forward, including the Germans, which we needed, and that there was one curious thing we had to agree to, which was that for the first 2 or 3 years, that any member of the German organization could be a member of ESA for free, and that they would get the new journal and not have to pay for it. And when we agreed to that, it allowed the president at the time of the German organization, who was Werner Guth, to apparently solve his political problem.
I see.
And that was the last thing we needed to put in place.
So if it wasn't for those last-minute fixes, ESA might not be what it is today.
That's right. Well, or also the initial things, and then that was the last fix, and that then cemented everything in place. So.
That's really really interesting. Let me ask you about the period in which you were director of ESL, 2001 to 2006. What were the kind of main avenues of research that you were pursuing at the time, and what was kind of going on at ESL during that period?
Yeah. There was a lot going on. One type of activity that was going on is that we got 2 $900,000 NSF grants to create and then do a national and international dissemination of EconPort, which was the first virtual lab and digital library in economics. So that was taking a major part of our activity to organize that. But there were lots of research projects going on. I was working extensively in experiments and theory, definitely a theory on trust, reciprocity, and altruism, and doing work with Vjosa Sidirai, Dan Friedman, Carrie Deck, Steve Jerstad, And there was a whole series of papers that came out of that work. I was also working with Violca Sidirai on theory and experiments on concavity calibration, or the so-called Rabin paradox. So we were working on that at the time. That also led to a series of papers later. I was doing experiments on small group decision making with Stephen Hain. But that's just my work and with collaborators. There was a lot going on. Martin Duffenberg was doing a tremendous amount of work on a variety of papers in psychological game theory, including the work with Gary Charness, the Promises and
Partnership.
Promises and Partnership. Martin was doing lots of other things on gender and competition and gender and as usual. He was, of course, as always, very, very active. There was work being done by Stan Reynolds on I/O experiments and on some auction experiments. There was work by David Riley on field experiments on auctions. John Wooders and Mark Walker were doing some of their collaborative research on the Wimbledon work and other theoretical and experimental topics. Trying to make sure I don't leave anybody out.
But we get the sense that it was a very active period at ESL.
It was very, very active, yeah. Oh, it's Sabina Kroger who was visiting. She was a postdoc at the time and was doing her experiments on social capital and other things. It was a large group that was being very, very productive.
Well, thank you very much for sitting with me for this interview, Jim. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to seeing the end result of the project.
Great.